The Lockdown is a Psyop, Part 2 by Andy Nowicki. This is, again, part of a series of essays that I wrote earlier this year, which were originally read aloud on YouTube, but then YouTube nuked my original channel. So now I'm rereading them. The Lockdown is a Psyop, Consequences of the Pandemic, Part 2, Anatomy of a Scamdemic by Andy Nowicki. I will not treat here of the matter of whether the virus is a true, quote, novel phenomenon, or the various problems with testing for it, or other disputed aspects regarding its origin. Let us simply, for the sake of argument, stipulate COVID-19's reality as an authentically newly formed microbiotic phenomenon. Certain concomitant truths about it are nevertheless well-nigh indisputable. Number one, the lethality rate of this supposedly novel disease is quite low. And two, those who die with this ostensible condition tend, as with most flu-related deaths, to be elderly, already in poor health, and or already suffering from underlying health-compromising conditions. Similar instantiations of novel viruses resulting in high levels of contagion but low lethality rates have been declared pandemic in recent years, most notably during the SARS outbreak of 2003 and the H1N1 virus or swine flu epidemic in 2009. As with corona COVID-19, these previous maladies most greatly impacted the already frail and decrepit. Those who were not elderly and or in relatively good health were rarely profoundly affected, much less killed by these viruses. Still, their contagiousness posed a problem which called for certain reasonable, non-onerous precautions to be put into effect, particularly among the aforementioned health vulnerable. Recommendations were thus duly administered: avoiding human contact whenever possible, washing one's hands often, applying disinfectant, etc. But no elaborate overhaul in social and economic conditions was mandated. Businesses were not forcibly shuttered. Schools remained opened. Restaurants and bars served dine-in customers. Sporting events, conventions, and concerts were allowed to take place, and no one was browbeaten to stay home or lectured to remain in a certain arbitrary distance from one another at all times. In short, while SARS and H1N1 raged across the globe, claiming numerous victims, life was still generally permitted to go on as before. By the time each of these previous outbreaks died out, millions had been sickened and many perished, but, as has been the case throughout human history, these sicknesses and deaths were taken in stride, though the latter were appropriately mourned, as the dead are ever and continually mourned, and normalcy was, for the most part, permitted to endure. Yet today, as of late April 2020, a supposed virus which, even if it be truly novel, does not differ markedly in virulence or lethality from these previous ones, has for some reason become the flashpoint for a declaration of emergency powers amongst ruling blocs in nations, provinces, and municipalities across the earth. This time around, for some reason, after SARS and swine flu, perhaps the third time's the charm, we find ourselves instructed, nay commanded, to respond in a manner that is utterly incongruous to the actual threat level on display. What is more, we discover that these same edict-issuing rulers, supposedly so zealously vigilant in their concern for the continued maintenance of our health and safety, are shamelessly stacking the deck by fudging the numbers, telling us that terminal cancer patients, heart attack victims, and so forth are in fact COVID-19 casualties. But even our duplicitous ruling claque can't conceal the truth that emergency rooms are mostly not filled with corona-plagued patients on the brink of expiration, but instead are largely empty and bare, with much of the staff getting laid off or furloughed, while those on duty seem to have enough time on their hands to coordinate elaborate flash mob dances on Twitter and TikTok, all while geared up in their scrubs, masks, gloves, and other hospital implements. Such displays of silly, frivolous, and debauched stripper-style gyrations in the hallways of hospitals that are supposedly battle zones of death and mayhem lends a certain surreality to the proceedings. Yet in spite of the inflated numbers and the furloughed staffs and the twerking nurses, in spite, that is, of the mounds of evidence that the crisis has been laughably overblown, we are still somberly commanded to consent to the veracity of their clearly bogus tale about a pandemic which threatens our civilization, or what is left of it, with the implication that it would be nothing short of treasonous of us to resist this untenable, unconstitutional lockdown for as long as our rulers see fit to continue to impose it. Under such circumstances, one needn't be especially astute to comprehend that this virus, even if it does truly exist in the manner that they claim, still represents little but a pretext to impose indefinite martial law. Again, the question of why this is being done now, and why such a pretext wasn't exploited in the recent past, with the outbreak of either SARS or H1N1, is surely not a question with a simple answer. That it all boils down to a raw, shameless seizure of power under deeply dubious auspices, however, strikes the discerning observer as quite impossible to deny, if he is honest with himself. Again, though, the why is not my primary focus in this inquiry. Yet, when one contemplates the proclivities of the ruling claque, as well as their patently reptilian characteristics, one is moved to wonder if the point of this collective power grab might not simply be to capture and delight in the possession of power for power's own sake. Thus, this entire usurpation could well be motivated more by the hunger of the nether regions of their filthy bowels than in the perverted thoughts of their depraved minds. Regarding the how, however, it must be reflected that our rulers have conducted massive reams of research on the methods by which men and women can be reduced to a state of mind slavery. It would follow that they possess both the means and the inclination to manipulate the public, whom they after all regard as mere pigs or cattle, to be herded or culled when necessary. It is well known that cognitive dissonance is a potent tool of torture. If an experimental subject is told two opposing messages simultaneously, and is induced into believing both messages with passionate and uncompromising intensity, that subject's consciousness will finally collapse under the strain, his neurons fried by the ordeal of attempting to make sense out of nonsense. I have discussed how our rulers have employed cognitive dissonance as a weapon against the populace with regard to this largely contrived, heavily manufactured virus crisis at hand. Next, I shall enumerate and explain other methods being used to create mass compliance, namely the inducement of demoralization, panic, and finally, hatred.